Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Paul van Geert. He is Professor Emeritus of Developmental Psychology at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He is renowned for his work on developmental psychology and the application of dynamical systems theory in social science. And today we're talking about topics like dynamical systems theory, developmental psychology, causality in psychology, process ontology, language development, theory of mind development, and other related topics. So, Paul, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.
So let's perhaps start with the very basics here, because I would like for the audience to understand the sort of framework you apply in your work. So what is dynamical systems theory?
Well, you can define it in a relatively technical, general way, and then it is defined as a way of describing how one state of a system changes into another state over the course of time. So, but then it means that you have to know what a state is. And to know what a state is, you usually talk about the state space, which is the space of all possible states of a system. For instance, if you think about a child learning language, you might say, well, let's call the state space the number of words it can use, which is an extremely simple state space. Or if you're a Piagetian, you might have a state space of, let's say, 4 qualitative differences. The typical stages of Piaget's theory. So once you have an idea of what your descriptive space will be to describe a system, like a child or a family or whatever else, then you can start thinking about the sort of principles or rules that drive the system or move the system from one state to another. Mm-hmm. For instance, what is it that drives the system of vocabulary in a child, for instance? My very first, very simple example. What drives that system from adding one word to the vocabulary? Or if you're a Piagetian, you can ask what drives the system from one qualitative state of cognitive, of thinking, of acting, into another state. So you need some sort of rule or principle to explain how the system moves in its state space, which is just a way of describing all the possibilities of the system.
Mm-hmm. And how do you apply dynamical systems theory specifically to the study of developmental psychology?
Well, you see, dynamic systems theory is a very well-developed branch of mathematics, and it's extremely abstract. And I'm not asking people, or I'm not asking myself to apply all these very abstract mathematical principles. But the way you actually apply it to development is to ask yourself, look, here's a child or a person or a family, and I want to study that family or that child from the viewpoint of development. What are the properties, descriptive properties, that I need to adequately describe that system, mm-hmm. and the way it changes over time? And then you have to ask yourself, am I interested in a combination of properties? Or am I interested in one particular property? Am I interested in different states? For instance, you can study the communication between a child and a parent, a young child and a parent, and then take let's say the space of emotional expressions they can show as your state space. So there's an example of a discrete state space. But the first thing you have to ask yourself is, how do I describe this system, this person, this relationship between persons from a developmental point of view? That's the first thing. And then the other thing you have to ask yourself if you apply to development is what are the principles of change? I mean, are they different all the time from moment to moment? So there is no fixed, let's say, principle or rule, or is there one master rule governing all the changes in the system? For instance, if you take the classical example of Piaget, he had this idea that it was always a matter of something that he called equilibration, and that consisted of assimilation. So let's say incorporating the new information into whatever you know or you can do, and accommodation, which means the principle of changing in relation to the way you have assimilated that new information. So in Piaget, there's an example of a very strict rule of change, but in most developmental theories, the changes are highly randomized. They are sometimes unpredictable. They are sometimes very complex. But you're obliged to think about the principles that govern the change over time, and that's how you can understand development in terms of a dynamic system.
But in this particular case, someone that comes from a different point of view in psychology, for example, could ask you, okay, so what you said is all great, but how do you prove, what's the evidence for psychology, particularly human psychology, being a dynamic system?
Yeah. Well, my first reaction would be, how can it be anything else but a dynamic system? That is to say, we are dealing with things that are under constant change. For instance, the discussion we have is an example of a process of things constantly changing over time. If you look at a person in a family, for instance, or at work, what you see is a process of constant changes. Activity is an example of constant changes. You do something, then you do something else. You might come back to what you started with, and so on. So in psychology, we are by definition dealing with things that are in constant change. In psychology, we are by definition dealing with things that we have to describe from a particular perspective of specific properties. Now, in psychology, these are typically called variables. Mm-hmm. But then my additional point would be that if you study these variables, you have to study them where and how they occur. And what psychologists are used to do is that they take big samples of independent subjects, and then they treat the variables as if they were sort of independent things that you can deal with, independent of the way they are embodied or realized in real person over time. So if you think that's feasible, let's say the general linear model of variables of psychology, then okay, I mean, my point is go on. But it's much more interesting if we really want to understand what psychology is about, to study the actual processes, the sequences of change that behavior and activity actually embody. And then you have to start with let's say the level of analysis where these processes occur, which is in individual subjects or individual people interacting with other individual people. So in short, my answer is what could it be else than a dynamic system?
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned there levels of analysis, I mean, I have a question for later on in our discussion, but I will introduce it here. So to what extent does the discussion surrounding levels of analysis play a role in your approach? I mean, how do you look, for example, at different levels of analysis, from the cellular to the organismic to the social and so on?
Yeah. Well, I'd say that in real persons, all these levels of analysis are intertwined. They are entangled. They are form one big very complex unity of interactions and change. But from the viewpoint of somebody who wants to understand it, you are, because what we are basically trying to do is to simplify this incredibly complex universe that we are dealing with. So one of the ways in which you can simplify it is by defining levels of analysis. For instance, if you look at an interaction between a child and a parent, you can say, well, what we take as the level of analysis are these two persons. There's a child and there's the adult. But of course, in reality, what happens there is that all the levels of analysis are operating at the same time. In the child, in the adult, things are operating on the level of neurons, of bodily reactions. They are operating on the level of social interactions, but they are also operating on the level of much higher social systems because they are made possible by the fact that there are these social structures and economical structures that make this kind of living and interaction possible. Mm-hmm. So choosing levels of analysis is a way of trying to get a grip on this incredibly complex reality. But it is very important to realize that these levels of analysis are basically let's say epistemological things. You choose them because they allow you to get a grip on, to manipulate, so to speak, that what you're interested in. But you should always be conscious about the fact that these levels of analysis are just relational, temporary ways of interacting with that what you're interested in. And that levels of analysis imply other underlying and let's say overarching levels.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that, of course, people want to try a good understanding of in psychology, theoretical psychology, is causality. What causes a particular behavior, for example. Does your approach change the way we understand causality in comparison to other more traditional approaches in psychology?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you follow a dynamic systems point of view or complex dynamic systems point of view, your basic ontology, let me say so, your basic view of the nature of the world is fundamentally processual. So you see the world as a system of interacting processes, not as a system of interacting substances of fixed units. So it's a processual point of view. Now, if you deal with a processual point of view, you have to ask yourself, what is it that causes this particular state of the process? Mm-hmm. Then the answer from dynamic systems is it's basically the preceding state or the history of the system. So then you are at the level of processual causality. So the next, which is also the definition of a dynamic system, the next state of the system is explained on the basis of the preceding state or states, and that's a form of causality that most psychologists find trivial, uninteresting. Mm-hmm. But in reality, I think it's a major form of causality, this processual causality. But what let's say mainstream, it's not a very friendly word, psychologists are used to calling causality is what philosophers have called intervention causality or manipulation causality, which means that there is a process, there is an ongoing process, and you can sort of intervene in the process by doing something. Right. This is, let's say, the current view on causality as a sort of directed graph with what the intervener is doing as the cause. And why is it defined as the cause? Because what you're doing is changing the process in comparison with what it would do if you would not make your intervention. And that's the sort of causality that we are used to think about. But it's philosophically speaking, it's basically one a highly pragmatically inspired definition of causality. Namely, if I do something in a process that is going on anyway, what will change in comparison to what would happen if I didn't do that? And then if you think about one of the major applications of causality in psychology is the causality of typical interventions in the literal sense of the word. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's a family, there are difficulties in the family, or the child does not develop as wanted. And then there's some external influence, for instance, a psychologist who intervenes with an intervention program, for instance, additional cognitive experiences, exercises, and so on. And then what you try to find then is that if you apply that to a group of cases, is there, let's say, a statistically significant difference between the group of cases that achieved the intervention and a group of cases, comparable cases, that did not achieve the intervention? And then the difference, let's say, is your of the cause, which is the intervention program. But that's a highly specific definition of causality, whereas in my view, the basic form of causality that explains how the world evolves and appears is process causality. Is the way a dynamic system describes it. Namely, the next state of the system is actually caused by, in some probably very complex way, by its preceding states and by additional influences or forces that might interfere in the process. And that's an entirely different way. For instance, if you discuss intervention programs, because with my students I have studied many intervention programs in schools and clinical intervention programs with children. Now the typical way, as I said, is to compare group effects and see the cause as some sort of probabilistic relation between outcome differences between two groups. But the actual cause of the change is the process. So you begin with something, then your class or teacher or students that you work with, they interact with you, creating a new, let's say, possibility for activity. Then you do something, then they do something. And it's this chain of events that will eventually, in the end, lead to something that is more or less, often not, stable in terms of the results. There's an interesting term introduced by Stuart Kaufman, one of the biologists who has been working in complexity theory. He calls it adjacent possibilities. So a process is actually a series of events, and every event creates a new range of possibilities, which are not infinite, but which are very constrained. So the next step is what happens within this range of adjacent possibilities. And it means if you do studies, intervention studies, as I said, I've done many of such studies with my students, is that you begin with the individual cases. So individual classes, for instance, that you work with. You try to map the change in the state space you have chosen over time. And then the results on the level of the group are basically mathematical artifacts. You can do that, I mean, because if there's a person like, I don't know, who wants to implement that in a school system in a country or so on, that sort of a person, like a minister of education or somebody else at that level will be interested in group differences, and I understand that. But the group differences are not, let's say, the level of reality for the psychologist. The level of reality for the psychologists are the individual processes, and those must be the starting point of your research, and you have to follow the individual processes over the course of time, as frequently in terms of observations as possible, feasible in the real world.
And since we are focusing here on developmental psychology, with that approach in mind, that understanding of causality, what is developmental change and how does it occur exactly?
Maybe you can elaborate on the question a little bit more, because so what you're asking is how would that view apply to understanding development?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that to understand development, you have to start with the processes. So the sequence of conditionally connected events over time at the level of description where they actually occur. For instance, in a particular child. And by doing so, and by trying to collect more and more cases, you might try to see whether there are certain similarities between the cases or what the typical so forth. Mm-hmm. And that's the way, that's the way you can apply it to development. But an important point for developmental studies is that you have to ask yourself, what are the dimensions of my state space? What are the possible states of a developing system if I treat it as a developing system?
Right.
Because I mean, yeah, we are all changing every second, every moment, but most of those changes do not fall under the umbrella of development. So you have to think about the sort of state space that you call a developmental state space, yeah. Which means that you have to think about progress, for instance, because development has this inherent connotation of possible progress, for instance, in terms of the complexity of thinking or the complexity of acting or the difficulty of problems you can solve and so on. So each time you apply this framework to development, you have to ask yourself very fundamental questions.
Mm-hmm. And do notions like stages of development and critical periods fit into your approach to development?
Yes, I think very nicely so, because if you have a complex dynamic system which consists of many interacting elements, think for instance about the child as a body. So a body is an example of interacting components on all different levels of organization, organs, cells, clusters of cells, the body in relation with other bodies in a cultural environment, and so on. So in let me see, I got a bit confused here. So your basic question was, how can you still repeat it?
Yeah, it was basically if notions that people frequently use in developmental psychology, like stages of development and critical periods.
Yeah, I know where I got lost now. The point is that in a complex dynamic systems, in a complex dynamic system, the interactions very often lead to states that are self-maintaining and self-reproducing. That's one of the major features of a complex dynamic system, which means temporal states of stasis, which is never static, but which is always the result of very complex processes of relationships and interactions. But the result of these interactions and processes, for instance, cognitive processes, interactions with other people in development, are of such a nature that they actually keep the system into one particular qualitative pattern. So they are self-reproducing, self-maintaining. And that actually nicely corresponds with the stage. A stage is basically a pattern of temporarily self-reproducing forms of thinking, for instance, in Piaget or whoever, or the neo-Piagetians who like Kurt Fischer, who worked with the notion of stages. But the notion of stages corresponds with what in dynamic systems theory is called an attractor state. So the system is through the way all the components interact is as it were attracted towards a state that will be self-reproducing for a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. But every system that is self-maintaining will nevertheless, if it is under, let's say, a constant pressure of some influence like experiences, they are coming in all the time, they are activities, they are carried out all the time, it will inevitably evolve towards a critical state. And a critical state is a state where relatively minor influence can change the structure of the system quite dramatically. So they are like tipping points or critical states. And it means that what works during these critical states, which are self-organized states of the system, will not work at times when the system is more or less very strongly self-maintaining. And that's, if you ask me, basically what a critical period is. Mm-hmm. It's a period of self-organized criticality where relatively minor events can change the course of the system. A minor event is defined or becomes important if the system attaches particular importance to it. For instance, if children become highly sensitive to what the environment is saying or doing, which are typical windows of opportunity, for instance, in language development, that basically means that you have a system which is on the verge of changing, that is a result of the way the system self-organized towards a critical state. And self-organization towards critical states has been studied in physics, for instance. The typical example is the sand pile model of Bach. But nowadays, students of the brain, for instance, have become to appreciate this self-organized criticality, that the brain is always self-organizing towards states of criticality, where it is particularly sensitive to all sorts of influences. That's the way the brain works. So the brain works by defining temporary states of self-maintaining stability, and will always move towards states of criticality where it is very sensitive to information that will change it. So it's, I think that complex dynamic systems provides a natural and very general framework for dealing with issues like stages and critical periods.
But through the point of view of dynamical systems theory approach in psychology, one can study dynamics, for example, at the level of real-time change, or dynamics that play out during an organism's lifespan. Do you think that it is important to distinguish between them, and do you focus more on one than the other, or not?
Yes, I think it is important to distinguish them because they are different but strongly interconnected dynamic systems in their own right. And why are they dynamic systems in their own right? Because they are characterized by their typical evolution rules. So what makes the system change on the level of an activity, for instance, is a different sort of evolution rule, temporal evolution rule in dynamic systems terms, than what makes the system change over the course of many years or over the course of the entire lifespan. So you're dealing with different principles of change, rules of change, and because they are different rules of change, you can make that distinction. Now, the rules of change that govern, let's say, a single activity of a person are of course fuzzy, and there's always a fuzzy transition to longer term time scale principles of change. So that there is no clear cut sort of barrier between one and the other. But still, it is possible to focus on one time scale as a form of organization and on another time scale as a form of organization. For instance, the time scale of immediate experience and interaction, governed by its own dynamics, and the time scales of lifespan development. But the two are, of course, very strongly intertwined, because what you're doing on the level of short-term interaction and activity will, of course, have an effect on long-term changes during your lifespan. But the long-term changes during your lifespan, which have changed your body, your brain, and your environment, will, of course, have a direct causal effect on what you do in the form of an activity. So there is this mutual, there is this coupling, and there is this mutual or reciprocal causality between these two levels of description. But I agree that the levels of description, although they are defined by their own rules of change, their own dynamic rules, the boundaries are fuzzy, like everything else in psychology, actually.
Mm-hmm. So earlier in our conversation, at a certain point when talking about what makes for a philosophical difference between what you called a process ontology and some of the more dominant perspectives in psychology that we still have today, you talked a little bit about what a process ontology is, but could you tell us a little bit more about what it is and how it differs from so-called substance ontology?
Yeah, the difficulty that I have to discuss first with these ontologies is that they are seldom, if ever, explicitly defined before people are starting to work on it. So let's say in mainstream psychology, which according to me and my co-author of the latest book, Naomi de Ruiter, is a substance ontology. Ontologies are always enacted. So an ontology is not an explicit set of let's say very explicit statements. I believe this, I believe that, but it's like an implicit set of things that become clear if you reflect on the way things are done. So it means that ontologies are first of all enacted. And that makes a difference. So the way, let's say, mainstream ontology enacts a substance, mainstream psychology enacts a substance ontology is by measuring variables as if they were real entities independent of the processes in which they occur. And then you read things like the relationship between social class and intelligence is this or that. So social class is taken as some sort of entity or reality that can be abstracted out of all the different people that you characterize with a social class. And intelligence is also some sort of thing that can be abstracted out of the activities, let's say, of intelligent acting that people show. So mainstream psychology enacts a substance ontology as if these psychological variables were some sort of real entities that have an existence on their own and that can be related and so on, and certain qualities of which might change, but that's typical of a substance ontology. And in our book, Naomi, for instance, has given a very detailed analysis of the way substance ontologies and process ontologies are working out in the case of self-esteem, which is a very important psychological variable, and it's related to self-representation and identity and so forth. But if you compare that with process ontology, which is also enacted through the way you do things, process ontology means that everything you study begins with a study of the temporal sequence of a time series of a real process on the level at which it occurs, which is usually an individual and very often an individual in relation with other individuals. So you start with meticulously studying the change over time of whatever variable or descriptive term you're interested in. And in terms of generalization, for instance, generalization, which is like a major magical term in mainstream psychology, where it means that you need to collect a sufficient number of individuals to arrive at generalizable statements that are true of the population, which means that they are true of the entity or substance that you are studying. In a process ontology, that's not your major question. Your major question is, first of all, how does a process occur? How does another process occur? How does a third process occur? Can we see similarities? Can we see differences? And so we can compare them, but there's no talk of generalizability in terms of which property is true of all the individual cases. If there is a property that is true for all the individual cases, then it's fine. But if there is no property that is true of all the individual cases, that's fine too. And that's the let's say, the state of affairs in the world, which you have to accept. Yeah. And there are lots of differences in the way, let's say, process ontologists do psychological research in comparison to the way, let's say, substance ontologists do it. But if you talk with a psychologist and you say, well, what you are basically doing is substance ontology, and I've had these discussions, most of my typical mainstream colleagues would say, oh, not at all, I'm studying processes, of course, and me, a substance ontologist, no, of course not. I do not agree with that. So once you start discussing this on the philosophical level, then you end up with a mess, basically. But if you look at the way they do things, it's quite clear that what they enact is a substance ontology. It's basically like in theater, where an actor enacts a particular kind of person, like a villain or something like that. It's if you watch a theatrical play, you see that what the actor is doing is impersonating a particular sort of character, but he or she is doing that by the activities, and it's the same thing with the research basically. So we are enacting ontologies.
And so, if there are these big differences between a process ontology and a substance ontology that, as you say, translate in practice into different epistemological approaches to psychology, how do you look at the relationship between them? Because if we have them both in psychology, let's say that, for example, a process ontology would be adopted in mainstream or in dominant psychology. I mean, would there be room for collaboration between these two different ontologies, or do you think that they are just incompatible?
Well, they are incompatible at the level of let's say, metaphysics or ontological philosophical discussions, and it's either this or that. But in practice, they are compatible because every dynamic system you imagine works in a sense with something that looks like an entity or a substance. For instance, if you work with a two-dimensional state space, your dimensions are a bit like substances. So pragmatically speaking, your dynamic point of view or your dynamic model is only possible if you take, for the time being, the level of substances or entities for granted. And in that sense, there will always be a possibility of exchange. But if you're a processual theorist, you know that these substances, these entities, are basically like loans taken on the processual nature of every substance. But for practical and pragmatic reasons, you can treat some aspects of your model in the classical way as variables, as real things, quote, and then the change of them over time as the processual part. But a processual theorist always knows that this is like a temporary point of view, because if you zoom in onto your elements, you see that they too are processes, and it's basically processes all the way down and all the way up. But you don't have to work all the time as if it's processes all the way down and all the way up, because you basically take, for simplicity alone, on let's say the processual nature by treating them as substances, as real things for the time being. But in practice, you see that there are incompatibilities in the sense that people who try to publish something, research that is based on a processual point of view, often these publications are often rejected on the grounds of the fact that they are not generalizable, and the sample is not big enough, and so on. So there are practical incompatibilities, but theoretically they are reconcilable, because you can collect many individual cases and then start generalizing in the traditional sense of the word. So there is the possibility of working together, as long as you don't try to transform it into some sort of metaphysical discussion about real essential differences. Then you end up in a mess, as I said, and it's
And so we've been talking about dynamical systems theory, but in cognitive science more generally, there's this approach of 4E cognition, that is inactive, embodied, embedded and extended cognition.
yeah.
In what ways does a process approach relate to that?
I think that this so-called 4E approach is like a specification of a general dynamic, complex dynamic system view to to the complex dynamics of persons, of organisms, of culturally embedded persons, and so on. So if you translate a very general mathematical framework of dynamic systems to, let's say, the reality of individual human beings and of social relationships, then you make a choice for the viewpoint of embodiment, because then you understand that you cannot treat, let's say, cognition as something that is independent, some independent substance that you can study, that can appear in a computer or in a person or whatever, or somebody from Mars, or I don't know. And you understand that all these things, all these mental things, are fundamentally embodied, which means that you understand that they are entangled and intertwined in the fact that all this takes place through a body, through an organism, in a concrete context. And the same is true for the other E's. It's always embedded in a context. You can, because they human persons are open systems. So what they are doing is always the cause is always taking place in interaction with the context. It's always enacted. So there's for instance, in cognitive science, there is no level of something mental that has a reality out of itself. It's the mental is basically that what is enacted in a particular form, and its activity that is the essential level of analysis, so to speak. So I think that this 4E approach is the natural sort of translation of abstract dynamic, complex dynamic systems theory to the level of human cognition, human activity, human interaction, and so on.
So, in the last part of this interview, I would like to get into, in a way, to illustrate all we've been talking about into two of the aspects of human psychology that you've studied yourself. So, starting with language development, could you tell us about how you view and approach language development through this dynamic systems theory perspective, and how it differs from some other more dominant approaches in, for example, linguistics, like the one coming from Noam Chomsky?
Yeah. Actually, language development was my starting point because it was an easy starting point in a sense, and it was also a natural starting point because for my dissertation way back in 1975, I studied the language development of my own son, which was very popular at that time. So you had to choose one particular quote subject, and actually write down in those times everything the child was saying. It's still done, but the interesting thing is that the logic underlying that method was actually Chomskyan logic. So the idea that the principles of language development were universal, and by studying individuals, if they are universal, you don't have to study, let's say, 500 babies or young children. You can take one. And if you take one, you'll see that it nicely follows the predictions of universal grammar, the way it evolves over time. But the result of these studies was that it turned out that there were incredible individual differences. That this very abstract level of universal grammar and Chomskyan linguistics was actually a sort of denying the complexity and reality of the real processes, which were much more interesting than so-called universal progressions.
Mm-hmm.
The universal progressions were usually almost trivial. Of course, I mean, you'll never see that children start with full sentences and then develop a stage in which they speak in one-word sentences, and then develop a stage in which they speak with 24 words. I mean, there's a trivial sequence there. It starts in a very simple way and it becomes more complex. But the way in which that process occurs over time in individual children turned out to be very complex, very individual, with lots of interesting connections with the way children perceive their world, with the way they interact with boys and with other people, and the study I did sort of made me sensitive to the fact that these individual processes must be your starting point, and must be your starting point without sort of predefined ideas about intrinsic underlying abstract universalities which were predicted by, for instance, universal grammar. And you have to look at it as a constructive process and so forth. And the other thing was that language development is a nice starting point, because it's to observe, let's say, or to create a state space of language development. You simply listen to what the child is saying and what you are saying, and then you can write it down. So it's easily interpretable in terms of language. So there were pragmatic reasons for me to start there. And then another difference is the way you treated these basic categories of language, like nouns and prepositions and verbs and so on. Instead of looking at them as if they were real entities, where you had to ask yourself, okay, the child is saying drink, but is this a verb or is this a noun? Well, and then you had lists of arguments. No, in fact, it's a verb. And then you had lists of arguments. No, actually, it's a noun, because these categories of verb and noun were taken as real entities. It's either or. But from a complex dynamic systems point of view, they are basically fluent, and they start out of an enacted system where they are neither or, they are both, and then they sort of gradually differentiate into something you can call a verb and something you can call a noun, and in some cases you simply never know what they are, but that's the reality of language development. So it was a much more fluent and dynamic, so changing way of approaching language development. So away from universal entities and universal principles. Actually, the only universal principle there was that what you were observing was a complex dynamic system, which was self-organizing, which was self-maintaining for a time, which was moving towards critical instabilities, towards sensitivities for what was coming in, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So getting into our last topic then, and the second example I was mentioning, theory of mind development. So
yeah.
How do you approach it? And in this particular case, perhaps to get into some of the other concepts that are present in dynamical systems theory. Could you tell us about what non-linearities are and how they apply specifically to the study of theory of mind development?
Yeah. Actually, what brought me to the study of mind development was the interest of a PhD student who wanted to study that in a clinical context, and who wanted to construct a test for a theory of mind. Now, actually, I never believed in theory of mind as some sort of internal structure or representation in children or persons. For me, theory of mind has always been qualities of processes, of interactions. And so I became intrigued in this idea of a test, because I see a test as nothing more than a very specific context in which you ask particular sorts of activities from children or from adults. And so this student, we are still collaborating, of mine and me, we were actually working from different ontologies. For me, it was deeply processual. For her, it was, I hope I don't misrepresent her thoughts about this, but for her it was much more like studying realities, in the sense of an internal theory of mind that you measured by means of the test. But for me, it was also an occasion to see whether you could find non-monotonic changes, also on the group level, because on the individual level, if you use a test, then of course there's a lot of processes that are going on, like the children learning to predict the test, the children learning what sort of things they should do in the test, and so, which is also very interesting, but it's not what tests are supposed to do. But so what we found were very unexpected non-monotonous, what's the word? Anyway, it was non-monotonous. What happened in terms of average scores over the ages. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was an interesting illustration of the fact that the idea that the development also on the group level is like a monotonous increase is in fact not true. There are interesting nonlinearities that we also found confirmed with a rich data set from Italy, but there were differences in age and so on. But to me, theory of mind is an embodied, enacted sort of thing, and not some sort of structure or theory in the mind of children. And a test for me is a specific context in which you can ask for specific activities, but it is not literally a measurement in the original sense of something internal. So the test results are by definition variable, and the variability is intrinsic to the way children or people take tests, and is not something that is a result of external influences like in classical true score theory.
Mm-hmm. And in this particular case, I would imagine that it is not also that idea that many psychologists have, that theory of mind is a sort of innate thing that inevitably develops in the same way across all children and humans. Right?
Yeah, well, if you start with the substance ontology, you can speak about innate things, in the sense that this particular substance or entity is given at birth, is genetically determined, and it's there, and because it's there, it unfolds like a present wrapped into paper. You basically unfold the paper, and there is a present, the present. So that's what substance ontology implies. It can be innate, and then it must unfold in a universal way. But the concept of innateness from a process point of view, I mean, also a processual theorist can speak about innate um, um, properties, like language, for instance. I mean, it's quite clear that it is innate in the sense that it's species specific. I mean, basically, as far as we know, it's only human beings
Yes.
with a particular genetic makeup and so on. So in that sense, the possibility of emergence is innate. But in that same sense, quantum physics is also an innate property, because there's no other species that has developed theories of quantum physics than human beings. So it must, in some sort, be given in our innate constellation. But that's, of course, an entirely different point of view than the innateness point of view that you find in the classical substance-oriented, because this is an open form of innateness, and so whatever will develop in the human species is yet another, let's say, possible realization of what is intrinsically innate, quote, in the human species. But it's not there at the beginning. I mean, it's completely open, but it's constrained in a sense. So constraints of development are in that sense innate givens. Yeah, we will probably never be able to fly the way birds fly. That's I think completely, well, not if you think about evolution over millions and millions of years, but if you think about a couple of thousand years, our body will not allow to fly like birds, but we fly in our machines. So those are all, quote, innate possibilities of the human condition.
Right. So, Paul, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Well, actually, the best source, although I need to actualize it, which I will probably do given this interview, but if they look at my website, they'll find my publications. But I have to update the last 1 or 2 years with references, and in some cases they can actually download it, and you can actually also read our latest book, for instance, because we made the chapters, the manuscript chapters, available on ResearchGate. That's I think the best source of obtaining or getting access to my work.
And in this case, you're referring to the book Toward a Process Approach in Psychology, Stepping into Heraclitus River. Right?
Yes, yeah. For me, that was like writing that book together with my former PhD student was like a culmination of many things that I've been thinking about over the last decades, actually, years. So and that's also a good source. Some people find it very illuminating, others find it quite difficult. It depends on what you're looking for, of course. But that's I think also a good source. Yes.
Yes, and I'm also leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview also, because actually a few of the questions we've explored there are also tackled in the book. So I think it's a great resource to link in the description
great,
here.
detail, actually. Yes.
Okay, so I'm leaving all of that in the description of the video. And Paul, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it has been a real pleasure to talk to you. I found your questions extremely well informed and really going to the let's say the core of my ideas. Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for all the efforts. Yes.
Okay, so let me.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for all the efforts. Yes.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please do not forget to share, like, subscribe, comment, And to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Pererga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf, Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Wintingberg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cusson, Hala Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Oeira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan, Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Landonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbojas, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Corizio Williamson, Peter Wallazin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Morey, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowleys, Kate Von Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, B.R., Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, and Jonas Hertner. A special thanks to my producers, Izar Webjim, Frank Lucas Tafinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.